It's really good to see you here all for this session on the moral circle, insects, AI systems, and other beings who might matter. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to be right here with you because I like being around people who are willing to question if they sufficiently care about others. My name is Tien van der Ploeg. I am the Executive Director of Animal Charity Evaluators, and I requested to MC this session because introducing Jeff Sebo is great. Who doesn't want to be vaguely associated and learn from his brilliance? Today, he'll help us further our thinking on which non-humans matter, how much they matter, and what we owe them in a world reshaped by human activity. Jeff argues that humanity should include all potentially significant beings in our moral community. And if we do that, that would have transformative implications for our lives and society. After his talk, we have time for some questions. Hopefully, it kind of depends because he has a lot of good content that is important, and also because the session turned out to be slightly shorter. But add your questions to swap card, and hopefully we get to them. If not, that's a great opportunity for you to join us at the Junior Ballroom number 4 for the office hours right after. Okay, let me get to our speaker, and I'm going to read this because I want to get it right. Jeff Sebo is Associate Professor of Environmental Studies, Affiliated Professor of Bioethics, Medical Ethics, Philosophy and Law, Director of the Center for Environmental and Animal Protection, Director of the Center for Mind, Ethics and Policy, and possibly my favorite, co-director of the Wild Animal Welfare Program at New York University. His research focuses on the ethics and policies for animal minds, AI minds, and global health and climate. He is the author of numerous books, including his most recent, The Moral Circle. And just in 2024, Vox included him in their prestigious list of 50 thinkers, innovators, and changemakers who are working to make the future a better place. Please welcome Jeff Sebo.
All right, thank you so much, Tien, for that very generous introduction. Thanks to Jordan and everybody else for organizing this and including me in the conference, and to everybody here for being here for the discussion. So as Tien said, I am here today to talk with you about the moral circle. This is our conception of who belongs in the moral community. To whom are we accountable? To whom do we have responsibilities? Now, obviously, for most of human history, especially in the West, we have had quite a narrow conception of the moral circle, extending consideration at most to select humans, maybe the occasional charismatic companion animal. Now, everyone at this conference, everyone in this room in particular, appreciates that is far too narrow. We, at the very least, ought to extend consideration to all humans and many non-human animals, mammals, birds, perhaps others, affected by human actions and policies. But should we go farther? And if so, how far should we go? What should the details be? What are the implications? Well, I argue in my new book, The Moral Circle, and will argue briefly at a high level in this talk today, that we should, in fact, go much farther, much faster, even than many philosophers appreciate. In particular, I think that we should extend at least some moral consideration right now to all vertebrates, many invertebrates, including insects, and some near-future AI systems, perhaps other beings too. Now, that is already more than a quintillion individuals alive at any given time. And so this is going to raise some challenging questions about how much do they matter? What do they need? What do we owe them? What are the implications for our policies and priorities and place in the moral universe, our presumption of human exceptionalism, this idea that we always matter most and take priority? Well, I will argue that, yeah, such radical moral circle expansion should come along with a substantial shift in our moral priorities. We have strong responsibilities to the non-human world, including the bugs and the bots. But we also have strong limitations epistemic, practical, motivational. And our strategic thinking about priority setting moving forward will have to reckon with what happens when our responsibilities and our limitations collide with each other. But we can get there a little bit later. As a first step, why do I think that we have a responsibility to extend at least some consideration to such a vast number, such a wide range of beings? Well, in my view, the question we should be asking is not which beings definitely matter, nor which beings probably matter, but rather which beings have a realistic, non-negligible, non-trivial chance of mattering, given the best information and arguments available. And I say that because this is a classic case of high-stakes decision-making involving risk and uncertainty. These issues are important. We interact with quadrillions of non-humans per year, whether we like it or not. And it can be easy and costly and harmful to make mistakes about whether they matter. Obviously, it can be easy to under-attribute moral status to non-humans, to treat them as lacking moral status even when they have it. That can be especially easy when they look and act differently than us, and when we have incentive to use them as commodities, as we do with farmed animals, and particularly farmed invertebrates. And this can obviously be bad because it leads to exploitation, extermination, suffering, death, often for trivial reasons. But it can also be easy, in some contexts, to over-attribute moral status to non-humans, to treat them as having moral status even when they lack it. That can be especially easy when they look and act like us, and when we have incentive to treat them as companions, as we do with many current generation large language models, for example. And that can sometimes be bad too, because, for example, it could lead us to divert scarce resources away from humans, mammals, birds, who really need them, and towards entities that in fact have no interests or needs at all. So the stakes are high. But this issue is also difficult because it touches some of the hardest problems in ethics and science. In ethics, we still have a lot of disagreement and uncertainty about what it takes to matter. Do you need to be sentient, able to experience happiness and suffering? Or is it enough to be conscious without being sentient, to be able to have experiences even without a positive or negative valence? Or is it enough to be agentic without being conscious, to be able to set and pursue your own goals in a self-directed manner, even if it feels like nothing to be you? And then in science, we still have a lot of disagreement and uncertainty about what it takes to possess those capacities. Take consciousness. In order to have feelings, do you need a brain with the exact materials and structures and functions of human or mammalian or avian brains? Or is it enough to have a cognitive system with broadly analogous capacities for perception, attention, learning, memory, self-awareness, decision-making, perhaps a global workspace that coordinates activity across these modules? Or is it enough to have a cognitive system that can engage in basic information processing or representation of objects in the environment? These debates are ongoing. These issues are highly contested, and they will remain contested for the foreseeable future. We are not, as far as we can tell, on the cusp of having a secure theory of moral standing or a secure theory of consciousness, for example, about which we can have anything approaching consensus or certainty. Our predicament now and for the foreseeable future is that we are one kind of being with one kind of mind, exercising power over and casting judgment on every other kind of being with every other kind of mind, with a lot of bias and ignorance, and without knowing for sure what, if anything, it feels like to be them, and whether they matter for their own sakes at all. That is a classic case of high-stakes decision-making involving risk and uncertainty, and it calls for caution and humility and tools that we can use to consider and mitigate risk. Now, we might disagree about exactly which tools to use and exactly how to use them, but we can all agree that non-negligible, non-trivial risks merit consideration. They merit mitigation. So why should we take AI safety seriously, for example? Not because AI systems definitely will destroy humans and other animals, not even because they probably will destroy humans and other animals. There might be only a 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 chance that in the near future, AI systems will kill all humans. But if there is a 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 chance that in the next 5 or 10 years, AI systems will hunt each and every one of us down, then that at least merits consideration. It should at least be one factor among many in our decisions about whether and how to scale up this technology. Similarly, I argue with my colleague Robert Long, Patrick Butlin, Dave Chalmers, Jonathan Birch, and others, why should we take AI welfare seriously? Not because AI systems definitely have morally significant interests, not even because they probably have morally significant interests. There might be only a 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 chance that in the near future, AI systems might experience flickers of their own version of happiness, suffering, satisfaction, frustration. But if there is a 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 chance that in the next 5 or 10 years, we could have created new kinds of beings that can experience their own version of positive and negative welfare, that at least merits consideration. It should at least be one factor among many in our decisions about whether and how to scale up this technology. So that gives us a baseline. If there is at least a 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 chance that a particular being matters for their own sake, then we ought to give them at least a little bit of consideration when making decisions that affect them, in the spirit of caution and humility as we investigate the matter further. And to that extent, in that spirit, we should include them in the moral circle. We can disagree about the details. Perhaps even lower probabilities of mattering deserve consideration. Perhaps we should give less consideration to beings who are less likely to matter. We can debate all that. But we can agree that a 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 chance of mattering is enough to merit a little bit of consideration. So that gives us a task. And the task is to estimate which beings have at least a 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 chance of meriting consideration. Now, unfortunately, this is a very difficult task, not only because we are forced to confront our bias and ignorance, but also because we have to estimate at least rough probabilities in a way that incorporates moral and scientific uncertainty, uncertainty about what it takes to matter and who has what it takes. Morally, we have to estimate the probability that particular capacities suffice for moral standing. And scientifically, we have to estimate the probability that particular beings possess those capacities, and then we have to put it all together. Now, I will not be able to walk you through every step of that process for all of the millions of kinds of beings to whom we might be accountable, but I can give you a flavor of how we go about part of it by telling you a little bit about a marker method that we use to estimate at least rough probabilities of consciousness in animals and AI systems. So the marker method starts with introspection. We can look inward and distinguish between conscious and non-conscious processing in humans. For example, I can tell the difference between when I feel pain versus when I have an unfelt nociceptive response. We can then look for observable behavioral or anatomical markers of conscious experience in humans. And we can then look to see whether those markers are present in non-humans of various kinds. And if we find those markers in non-humans, that is not proof of consciousness. It does not establish certainty of consciousness. That is unavailable when we lack a secure theory of consciousness. But it does count as evidence of consciousness. It can tick up the probability according to a wide range of leading scientific theories of consciousness. So for animals, for example, we can ask, not only do they have the same brain and body structures that light up when I feel pain, but also, for instance, do they nurse their own wounds? Do they respond to analgesics and antidepressants in the same ways that we do? Do they make behavioral trade-offs between the avoidance of pain and the pursuit of other valuable goals, like a nice new shell or food? With AI systems, we are not presently able to trust behavioral evidence in the same kind of way that we can with animals because we lack the evolutionary and anatomical continuities with AI systems that we have with animals, and because we know that many AI systems, like large language models, were specifically designed to mimic human behavior. So when your chatbot tells you, I am conscious, or I am not conscious, you are not able to give much evidential weight to that utterance at all. But we might, at some point soon, be able to design AI systems whose behaviors would count as stronger evidence. And in the meantime, we can look underneath their potentially misleading behaviors for architectural, computational evidence of perception, attention, learning, memory, self-awareness, decision-making, a global workspace, etc. Now, when we look for that evidence, what do we find? With animals, when we look, we do tend to find some markers. So for example, in spring 2024, leading scientists from around the world came together for a conference at New York University that I hosted along with Kristen Andrews and Jonathan Birch, and we released the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness. This declaration holds that the current scientific evidence supports at least a realistic possibility of consciousness in all vertebrates, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fishes, and many invertebrates, including, at minimum, cephalopod mollusks like octopuses, decapod crustaceans like lobsters, and insects like ants and bees. That is already more than a quintillion individuals alive at any given time. The declaration also holds that when there is a realistic chance of consciousness in an animal, we have a responsibility to consider welfare risks for that animal when making decisions that affect them, in the spirit of caution and humility. Now, with AI systems, we do not yet have much evidence of consciousness in particular in current large language models and other AI systems. But we might have quite a bit of evidence very soon. In fall 2023, my colleagues Robert Long and Patrick Butlin led a team that investigated large language models at the time for architectural computational indicators of consciousness according to a range of leading scientific theories of consciousness. And while they found that relatively few markers are present right now, there are no obvious technical barriers towards the creation of AI systems with advanced and integrated versions of many of these markers in the near future. And in fact, AI companies and governments are racing towards the creation of exactly those kinds of AI systems because many of the capacities that would indicate consciousness would also indicate intelligence. And so we might, in the course of trying to develop artificial general intelligence, accidentally, without realizing it, create artificial consciousness and happiness and suffering as well. So, what about other beings, plants, fungi, microbes? Without going into as much detail about them now, I will say, when we look at them, we end up being surprised by how sophisticated they are too. There might not be as much evidence in favor of plant, fungi, microbial consciousness as there is for, say, insect consciousness or near future AI consciousness, but there is more than zero evidence. So in my view, we should regard all vertebrates, many invertebrates, some near future AI systems as clearly having at least a 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 chance of mattering. And then we can debate whether plants and fungi and microbes make the cut. That is a significant shift in where we are looking to determine the edges of the moral circle. But even if we set aside plants, fungi, microbes, the other beings I have mentioned still place us in a really difficult predicament. All vertebrates, many invertebrates, some near future AI systems, that is a vast number and wide range of individuals who might matter. And so it does raise those challenging questions that I mentioned before. How much do they matter? What do they need? What do we owe them? What follows for our policies and our priorities, our presumption of human exceptionalism? And how can we honor the weight of our responsibilities towards them while also honoring the weight of our limitations, how little we know, how little we can do, how little, unfortunately, we care as a species right now? Well, I will argue that we should, in fact, prioritize them much more, including, again, the bugs and the bots, but in a way that is cognizant of our limitations. And that will mean combining radical long-term goals involving inclusion and egalitarianism with moderate short-term steps involving co-beneficial policies for humans and animals and AI systems. So in particular, I want to focus on 3 issues. First, how much intrinsic value does everyone have? Second, how much relational value does everyone have to us as the decision makers? And third, what are the epistemic, practical, motivational limitations of which we need to remain mindful? How do we put it all together? First, how much intrinsic value does everybody have? You might take solace in the idea that even if a fruit fly matters, you still matter more. From my perspective, you are more likely to matter, and you are likely to matter more because of how continuous you are with me and how complex your brain is and how long your lifespan is. By my lights, you are more likely to be able to experience happiness, suffering, satisfaction, frustration, and you can experience much more at any given time, and especially over the course of your life. And that means if a house is burning down and I can save you or a fruit fly, I can, and plausibly should, pick you instead of flipping a coin without being speciesist. So, fair enough. But we might not always have higher stakes, have more intrinsic significance than non-humans in those ways. Some non-humans, in some respects, have more complex brains than we do. African elephants have 3 times as many neurons. Some non-humans also have longer lifespans than we do. Immortal jellyfishes, if they matter at all, they can live for quite a long time. In the future, advanced AI systems could have substantially more complex brains and substantially longer lifespans. And even if we matter more than the vast majority of non-humans individually and on average, remember, there are a lot of them. They can still matter more than we do collectively and in total. Even if I matter millions of times more than the average insect. There are about 8 billion humans, and there are 1 to 10 quintillion insects alive at any given time. So if we allow that welfare, that moral significance can be aggregated, added up across members of a population, we may face a rebugnant conclusion that a sufficiently large number of small beings can matter more than a sufficiently small number of large beings overall. And if we want to block that result by insisting that we are not, in fact, able to aggregate welfare, moral significance across members of a population, if we want to insist that if I matter more than any particular insect, that means I matter more than any arbitrary number of insects, well, then we might find our centrality challenged from the other direction, because we would face the result that a single, highly complex AI system, if they matter more than one human, then they also matter more than any arbitrary number of humans. Ultimately, our fate, due in part to our own actions, might be that we are a medium-sized population of medium-sized beings sharing the world with much larger populations of much smaller beings and much smaller populations of much larger beings. And it is difficult to imagine a principled, non-arbitrary theory of population ethics that implies that we happen to have hit the magic recipe and we matter the most, we matter more than all populations in both directions. No, we have less intrinsic value from an impartial perspective than the non-human world. But you might think, that was never really the reason why I can prioritize myself and my fellow humans. I can do that not because of how much intrinsic value they have, but rather because of how much relational value they have to me, the human decision maker. So think about family. Even effective altruists these days will grudgingly acknowledge that we can and should prioritize our family to some extent in everyday life. I should feed my family before I feed all of the strangers of the world. And we should do that not because our families have more intrinsic significance than the entire rest of the world, but rather because of how we relate to our family members. I have special bonds of care and interdependence with my family members, and that gives rise to special responsibilities to care for them. And that simply does not extend all the way to the entire rest of the species. But you might think it does extend a bit to the rest of the species, that I have, to an extent, bonds of care and interdependence with the global human population, and that gives rise to special duties to care for the global human population, which does not extend to all of the bugs and the bots in the world. And to that extent, you might think that I have a relational reason to prioritize my fellow humans over the vast multiplicity of other beings who might matter. We can debate whether we do, in fact, have those relational responsibilities and whether they do, in fact, extend to humanity as a whole. But suppose for the sake of discussion that we do have them and they do extend to humanity as a whole, at least a bit. We might not always have stronger bonds with fellow humans than with non-human animals. I dare anyone to matter more to me than my dog Smokey does, for example, and I think a lot of people probably have a similar experience. Also, even if we do have special responsibilities to our fellow humans, that does not justify anything like the status quo of human exceptionalism. Yeah, I can feed my family before I feed your family, but that does not mean I can murder your family to feed their flesh to my family, because we have a mild preference for human flesh over rice and beans. Nor does it mean if my family already had a meal and yours is starving, that I should still prioritize my family and give them a second helping instead of giving your family food that they need so they can survive. At some point, the stakes over here trump the relational priority over here. And also, bonds of care and interdependence are not the only morally significant relationship that we need to consider. Another morally significant relationship is, are we wielding power over vulnerable populations? Are we imposing risks and costs and harms on vulnerable populations? If so, we have a special responsibility to care for them and to reduce and repair the harms that our actions are imposing on them. And in the Anthropocene, a world reshaped by human activity, agriculture, deforestation, development, technology, climate change, we increasingly stand in that morally significant kind of relationship with many, most, possibly all, potentially morally significant non-humans. So when we consider intrinsic value and relational value, all things considered, it is hard to reject the conclusion that the non-human world matters a lot, even the bugs and the bots, and that we have very strong responsibilities to them. Again, even the bugs and the bots in the aggregate. But as I said before, responsible decision-making moving forward requires reckoning with what happens when our very strong responsibilities to the non-human world collide with our very strong limitations, our epistemic, our practical, our motivational limitations. Go back to family. Part of why I can prioritize my family is that I have bonds of care and interdependence with them. But part of why I can prioritize them is also a combination of epistemic and practical and motivational reasons. I know them really well. I know how to take care of them. They live right here. I have an infrastructure for supporting them. I love them, and so I wake up every day feeling motivated to support them. Also, I need to take care of myself, and my family, we need to take care of each other in order to collectively be able to achieve and sustain any measure of support for strangers in the long run. And for all of these reasons, epistemic, practical, motivational, the indirect benefits of caring for ourselves, I can be warranted in giving a little bit of priority to my family. And we might once again think that this applies to an extent to humanity as a whole, that we know more about how to help each other than about how to help the bugs and the bots, that we are more capable, we have more of an infrastructure, more institutions for helping each other than we have for helping the bugs and the bots, that we certainly have much more political will for helping each other right now than we have for helping the bugs and the bots. And that we need to take care of each other. We need to improve human lives and societies so that we can collectively achieve and sustain any amount of support for the non-human world moving forward. I think these are good arguments. I think these are good reasons to moderate our ambitions and expectations for ourselves in the short term. We should not, as a result of my arguments here today, persuade world governments to allocate 99% of global GDP to caring for fruit flies and chatbots this year. But that does not justify anything like the status quo for human exceptionalism either. Because we can do much more for many non-humans while taking care of ourselves and improving human lives and societies. If we simply consider them, if we simply include them in our moral circles, then we might be more likely to identify co-beneficial win-win policies that are good for us and for them at the same time. We can find approaches to food system reform that are good for humans and farmed animals and the environment at the same time, not insect farming. We can find approaches to infrastructure reform that are good for humans and wild animals and the environment at the same time, including, light pollution policies and lawn maintenance policies that can be better for insects. We can find approaches to AI development that are good for humans and animals and near future AI systems at the same time. Presumably this involves moving a little bit slower, doing some global governance. And we might find that we can at least occasionally make minor sacrifices in exchange for major benefits for non-humans. We might have that within our capacity now. And most importantly, knowledge, power, political will, these are resources that we can build over time. We can learn more about how to help the non-human world. We can build more infrastructure, more institutions for helping the non-human world. We can use education and advocacy to build political will for helping the non-human world. So what I would like to see for our species is a theory of change that involves combining radical long-term goals of inclusion and egalitarianism, giving all due consideration to everyone who might matter, with moderate, incremental, short-term policies that can be co-beneficial for humans, non-humans, and the environment, or make minor sacrifices from time to time for the sake of the non-human world, and that can build that knowledge, build that power, build that political will towards more ambitious future changes. And in that respect, I like to think of humanity as kind of in an adolescent stage in our development. Will McCaskill has made this analogy too, and I like it. Think about a high school or college or law student. Of course they need to focus on themselves. They have to go to school, they have to go to work, they have to make ends meet, invest in their education and development. But they can still be kind to others along the way. And if they do that work well and they get lucky, maybe they can grow into someone with a much greater capacity to care for others. Maybe they can win the lottery, be a partner at a law firm, earn $10 million a year. And if they do, then at that point, they really should give a majority of their resources to strangers while still having a good life. Now, I think of our species as in a similar place in our trajectory. Of course, we should focus on ourselves to an extent right now. We have to do a lot of work to improve human lives and societies, invest in our education and development. But we can still be much kinder to others along the way. And if we do that work well, and if we get lucky, we could eventually have a much greater capacity to care for the non-human world. We could even end up being the equivalent of that partner at a law firm, where we can achieve and sustain so much altruism that we could give a majority of our resources to the bugs and the bots while still taking care of ourselves. If we ever did realize that world, then I think we would actually have a responsibility to prioritize non-humans over humans. But that would be a wonderful responsibility to have. It would be a vindication of all the hard work we have done over the course of generations to arrive at that place. So I would love to set that as our collective aspirational goal, and then think together about how we can find these concrete, specific, short-term policies that we can use to build momentum in that direction. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much. Didn't disappoint at all. I want to start with something that you more or less ended on, you refer to potential short-term policies. Can you give some examples for animals and AI?
Yeah, absolutely. I will try to be brief because I know we only have about 10 minutes. So you can think about farmed animals, you can think about wild animals, invertebrates, AI systems. For farmed animals, there is a lot of interesting work that shows how we can build momentum towards eventually ending, even banning, factory farming and industrial animal agriculture. This can include informational policies that raise awareness about food systems, financial policies that shift financial incentive through taxes and subsidies. It can include regulatory policies that ban the worst excesses of factory farming and industrial animal agriculture. And it can include just transition policies that take care of farmers and workers and consumers along the way. And all of these policies together can very significantly shift incentives so that everybody is a little bit more inclined over time to produce and consume plant-based products instead of animal-based products. For wild animals, our team is exploring a variety of interventions that can be co-beneficial and politically tractable in the short term. For example, last year, our Wild Animal Welfare Program released an infrastructure report about how cities and other local governments can pursue infrastructure reforms as they try to make their infrastructures more resilient and sustainable in the face of human-caused climate change. How can they consider animals too and build a safer infrastructure for humans and animals at the same time? Bird-safe glass in more energy-efficient buildings, overpasses and underpasses and wildlife corridors on green transportation systems, many other examples. Finally, briefly, insects. How about we pursue avenues for food system reform other than insect farming, while we also find alternatives to insect research? And for AI systems, along with Elios AI, our Center for Mind Ethics and Policy in fall 2024 released a report called Taking AI Welfare Seriously that recommended minimum necessary first steps for AI companies. Acknowledge AI welfare as a credible, legitimate issue, not a science fiction issue or a problem only for the far future. Start assessing your models for welfare-relevant features, as we do with animals, and prepare policies and procedures for treating AI systems with the appropriate level of moral concern in the future so you can be ready when the time comes, rather than waiting for a crisis to emerge and then looking to your PR team for guidance about what to say. That is not going to be a sustainable strategy.
That makes me think that if you want to work on policies, and also I think there are some people in this room here who work in media or who write, that requires us to also be able to communicate and talk about these topics with people who might be less philosophical inclined or less utilitarian. How do you recommend we talk about these things?
Yeah, great question, and a really important question, because ultimately this does need to enter education and advocacy and policy where people will disagree about these assumptions. So for people who are not utilitarian inclined, I think we can emphasize that every argument that I offered here today and every argument that we can offer is pluralistic in nature. Yes, caring for these non-human populations can promote welfare from a utilitarian perspective, but it can also respect rights from a rights theory perspective. It can cultivate a virtue of care from a virtue ethics perspective. It can build caring relationships and just social structures from a feminist care ethics perspective. So you can marshal insights from all of those traditions to make these arguments. For people who are not philosophically inclined, I think it helps to note that in a world reshaped by human activity, human and non-human fates are linked. And often, these kinds of food system reform, these kinds of infrastructure reform, these safer, more cautious approaches to AI development, these can be co-beneficial. They can be good for humans and non-humans and the environment at the same time. So we can make a combination of altruistic and self-interested arguments for many of these policy reforms in the short term.
Let's look at Swapcart. Okay, can you give an example of an intuition you had when you started working on these issues, which you now realize is completely wrong?
Well, one important conclusion of this work is we are not yet in a position to say whether any particular intuition is completely right or completely wrong. We gotta maintain a certain open-mindedness about these issues. But I will say, when I started writing my book, The Moral Circle, I set out to argue for moral consideration for insects and AI systems, other beings like that. And then along the way, I found myself persuaded by my own arguments that I, in fact, should also extend at least a little tiny bit of moral consideration to plants, fungi, microbes. And I was not looking for that conclusion. I was not trying to establish that conclusion, but now I grudgingly have to accept that my arguments lead me to that conclusion, and I have to live with that.
This is honest and useful. Okay, I think we can do at least one more question.
Sounds great.
From Arthur. When we consider very low probabilities of fungi, plant, microbe consciousness, how do we avoid Pascalian conclusions?
Ooh, yes. So I mentioned the rebugnant conclusion earlier. In the paper where I introduced that, I have another bug pun, which is Pascal's bugging. And it discusses exactly this issue. So Pascal's mugging, briefly, this will be a little bit of a variation on it. But basically, the idea is, suppose a mugger walks up to you, and instead of pointing a gun in your face and saying your money or your life, the mugger says, hey, you know what? I built a bunch of bombs around the planet. And unless you give me $5 right now, I will detonate all of the bombs, killing humans and animals everywhere. And then shows you a bunch of schematics about how exactly the bombs work and how exactly this will happen. And you might think to yourself, this person is almost certainly bluffing. This is almost certainly a bluff designed to get $5 from me. But they do seem to know what they are talking about. And I'm not able to have a confidence of 0 that these bombs will go off. And so maybe rationality does require giving the mugger the $5. Now, this is a common problem for decision theory and expected utility theory. And you could deal with it by setting a threshold below which very low risks get rounded down and they count as negligible, or you could deal with it in another way. But the present point is simply that the same exact problem will arise in this context too. Think about, for example, plants, fungi, microbes, even electrons. Is there a non-zero chance that panpsychism is true and electrons have a little tiny bit of morally significant experience? Are we really able to rule that out right now? And if not, are we stuck with this possibility that there is this vast number of entities in the world that have an astronomically low chance of mattering and astronomically little value if they matter at all, but they exist in such large numbers that in the aggregate, in expectation, their value still swamps ours? That would be unsettling. So without trying to solve that problem here, I will simply say that we have to consider all of the same arguments and objections and replies that people consider in other contexts when dealing with these Pascalian issues. We have to consider that here too. And a lot could end up being at stake based on how we answer those questions.
I'm going to leave it at that and hope that many of you will follow Jeff to the office hours. Thank you again so much, not just for helping us think about this, but also doing it with this energy, because these are big questions and are difficult and sometimes sad. And I really appreciate that you help us through that. Yeah, I think that is it. Thank you. Please, one more round of applause for Jeff. And thank you for being here.
Thank you, Steen. Thank you again, everybody, for attending.